Good day, gentlemen, particularly boxing fans, because today is the day Muhammad Ali dodged the draft. That's right. He refused his induction into the United States Army for the Vietnam War by claiming of being a conscientious objector as well as a Muslim, and following the Quran, he could not go to war, an offensive war, unless commanded directly by Allah. This resulted in Muhammad Ali getting banned and stripped of his championships for over 3 years until the ruling was overturned by the Supreme Court. Now, what does this have to do with the video of today? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The video of today is that Ion went on another interview. This time a Western interview because it was with the man of the North, Preach himself. So this interview is actually pretty good. It's also in English, so you should be able to watch it, put it on your second monitor. Background noise. There are some pretty good questions, some pretty interesting questions, which extend and expand on what he already said a few days ago in the Chinese interview. And we're going to go over, at the very least, the points that were not touched in the previous interview. So the new things, the new stuff that Ion is mentioning. Now, just in case someone was doomsaying, because I already heard some of these people, for some reason, I don't know, as if there would be something to be happy about, Ion mentioned that, of course, there is going to be a 9.2, of course, there's going to be a new raid and tier, etc., after 9.1. Some people were trying to say that, Shadowlands is like super late and delayed, and they've had problems with the pandemic, so it's gonna be a scuffed expansion. There is no plan of stopping halfway through with the development. It's proceeding as planned, although a little bit stretched. As we know ourselves, since the first 9.1 patch is gonna come very late into the expansion. One of the first questions was about Korthia, the new zone. The general answer by Ion was that they wanted to sort of give more content to Outworld player. Now, he seemed pretty excited about Korthia itself, mentioning that there is still a lot of stuff that is yet to be seen in Korthia and that is going to have more zone events, daily quests and rares, etc. Now, from where I was in Korthia, doing the campaign quests and some of the daily quests in there, it does seem more or less just like your run-of-the-mill Mechagon zone or Najatar zone, maybe one of the reused when we went into the Nyalota tier, Uldum and the Valley in Pandaria. It seems about similar. I'm not exactly sure how much people are gonna get into this new zone because of the zone events, the daily quests and the rares. I guess the collectors can go in there since there is at least something like, 6 mounts available in the zone. The zone isn't too big either. It's not too difficult to traverse, even if you don't have flying. At the very least, you do have the ability to mount up in the zone. Another question that popped up by some players, for some reason also, is any plans to refund legendaries in patch 9.1? This was a weird question because with so much time between 9.0 and 9.1 for you to stockpile Soul Ash, you should have literally no problems crafting multiple legendaries for multiple specs, even backups of your multiple specs. By this point, if you have done every week, if you have gathered Soul Ash every week, you have something like enough Soul Ash for 6 different rank 4 legendaries. I'm not too sure what exactly is the issue with wanting to refund your legendary crafting. I know Blizzard is in the process of tuning and balancing some of the legendaries, nerfing some, making them become less powerful, less usable. Because of the time difference, because of the time gap we have from 9.0 to 9.1, I don't think refunding legendaries is a necessity. And Ion agrees, since he says there is no plan of refunding legendaries in 9.1. One specification though, one clarification is that, in case you thought about it, Covenant-specific legendaries are not going to swap themselves to a different Covenant if you reroll to a different Covenant, which is actually pretty interesting. It could have been a system. Not to have 4 different Covenant legendaries, but a single meta Covenant legendary, which is going to change itself depending on the Covenant you're in. That could have been interesting. It could have also possibly inspired some people to try out a new Covenant because they already have the one purpose legendary for the Covenant itself, but no, you have to craft individually each of the legendaries for each of the Covenants. Now, Ion also went on and specified, this is the more poignant point of information we learned from this interview about the questions of Mega Soul Ash, the currency, the material that was renamed to Soul Cinders. Now, we now have the full answer We knew already that Soul Cinders was going to be obtained from layer 9 to layer 12, and that very likely Soul Ash is what you would have obtained from the previous layers. Now, unfortunately, we have the confirmation that Soul Cinders is what is going to be used to craft your legendary. We already went and reported the Vestige of Origins item you can craft. That is what you craft for the legendary blank piece. So the rank 5 and the rank 6 are no longer going to be those profession-only pieces that you need to grind up to rank 10 before you get them into the next tier, etc, etc. You will have to go through this new recipe to craft the actual blank 250 item level legendary piece. And then once you have the blank item, the way you craft it is going to be with Soul Cinders instead of Soul Ash. So yes, definitive answer from the lead game designer, you will need to do Torghast every week in 9.1 to gather Soul Cinders to get your legendaries to rank 5 and then eventually rank 6. And also, as speculated, Soul Ash will remain as the currency for you to get your catch-up mechanism for your legendaries from rank 1 to rank 4, without having to lose your main current currency, which is pretty good. You might feel bad, right, if you're trying to gather Soul Cinders to craft your best-in-slot legendary, but at the same time, you also kind of want to bring up your off-spec legendary, but you can't, because you don't want to spend your currency for an off-spec stuff. You know, it's a waste. You don't want to waste your main pricey currency for something that is less important, like an off-spec, an off-roll. With this system, you can keep Soul Cinders to craft your main stuff, and then you can use your Soul Ash to bring up your off-spec legendaries. Then we also have a taste of Eon's old evasiveness and elusiveness regarding the question for Conduit Energy. Conduit Energy is pretty weird. Nobody likes it. It's sort of like an afterthought for many people, and the only time people will remember Conduit Energy is a thing is when they will start to be cock-blocked by it. Particularly specs that have different plans on how they play between raids and between Mythic Plus, even within the same spec. So they have to change some of the conduits, maybe even some respecking. Someone who, for example, DPS is in a raid but then goes a healer or goes as a tank in Mythic Plus. Those are the type of players that can spend quite a lot of Conduit Energy. Maybe not as much now. Maybe not as much now that many guilds, many players are just farming the raids, and plus they are easy, there's no progress, there is no need to min-max your character anyways, so the Conduit Energy being spent is not that major and important, but at the start of the expansion or the start of the tier, when everything is new and you have to progress on everything, and you want to try to min-max your character as much as you can, Conduit Energy can be a problem. The answer for Eon, as I said, was pretty evasive. He admitted that Conduit Energy is imperfect and they are trying to work on a better system. They wanted to avoid, as they mentioned this multiple times, a system where you're free to constantly swap conduits on every boss, because then it would feel like those are like talents that you can just swap every single time, whereas they wanted something a little bit more permanent, but not as permanent. However, the Conduit Energy system was a little bit of a failure. So yes, they're working on it, they're thinking about it, they're planning some changes, but we know nothing about it so far, so we will just have to see. For now, there is just an acknowledgement of the issue, not really any plans to fix it yet. Then we do have the questions about Torghast. I'm going to make a specific video about the new changes to Torghast. We also already touched onto this, the new system where you're going to have up to 5 stars that are going to track your overall progress. You need to get to 4 stars to get to the following score. You're going to get a score streak based on the things you do in Torghast, like freeing souls, getting Phantasma, or just killing enemies and killing elites. And more importantly, there is going to be a meta Torghast talent tree, just like the Horrific Vision talent tree. So a bunch of, buffs and elements that are going to empower your character that are only going to work within Torghast. Another very important thing that we get confirmation about for Torghast is that there are no plans to give Torghast gear progression. This is something that was speculated before, particularly because of the data mine strings about, for example, experience being in Torghast, possibly using Torghast as a leveling tool. And if it is used as a leveling tool, then it's very likely should have gotten or would have gotten a gear progression. Otherwise, you will keep leveling up in Torghast with the old crappy gear from level 50. But no, there are no plans to give Torghast gear progression, and very likely that string was related to your score system and not really to your leveling system inside Torghast. There is also a question trying to shed some more light on another thing that we mentioned was being data mined, but without any actual implementation into the game, which was the Shards of Domination. Basically, those special sockets that we saw on cloaks, and those few available meta gems that we saw in the data mining. Ian said this is a very early on work in progress. The whole idea of the Shards of Domination is basically to empower raid gear to make raiders more powerful in raid based on the raid gear. Right now, for example, a very good PvP player is going to be able to be 227 item level, filled with 226 from PvP gear, plus the 233 weapon from the elite loot in the Great Vault. So basically he's going to be almost exactly the same as a raider. With this, they're going to empower raiders by essentially giving them some sort of unique bonus that you can only find in the Sanctum of Domination. They want to basically add bonuses for select pieces of gear that can drop exclusively from the raid. And the bonuses are going to work only in the raid. That is the goal. That is sort of like Benthic gear from Najatar. The difference is that Benthic gear was obtainable by everyone. Yes, it would only function in the raid, but all you had to do is a bunch of daily quests and killing some special mobs on some rares to get your mana pearls, and then play the roulette, play the slot machine and try to get a socketed best in slot Benthic piece, and you were set. This change though is just much more raid specific, to try to give more powers to raiders in raid gear in the raid. Talking about raiding, there is also the confirmation that raid sets, good old tier sets dropping in a raid, are going to come in patch 9.2. There was no question related to Mythic Plus about is there going to be a way to get these tier pieces in Mythic Plus as well. I don't think the answer is going to be any different than what you expect, which is no. Raid sets are called raid sets because they're going to drop in the raid. That's probably what it's going to be. Now we go into some of the cooler meta questions, not really strictly related to new 9.1 things themselves. The question about borrowed power. What are Ion's thoughts about borrowed power? Also compared to what we have now in Shadowlands with what we had in BFA. The general idea of Ion that he gave is that they are trying to hold themselves from adding more and more abilities, more and more passives, more and more interactions with your set, with your toolkit as a spec and as a class, because then there is going to be some bloat if you do not. If you add more levels or more talents, eventually it's going to become hard to think of, cool new things or extra things to add to the class, to the spec, before it becomes unsustainable. They want to figure out a way to leave the RPG element in WoW, where you're sort of unique, but you have strengths and weaknesses, and you have to decide what to choose, basically what to pick for your character. At the same time, though, allowing you to keep some of the things that you have learned between expansions, rather than losing them every time. They need to find a middle ground, basically, between the borrowed power system and your default core system of your spec. Overall, he says they are happy with how Shadowlands has gone, and you have to say, if you played BFA, even Legion actually, so far, when it comes to borrowed powers, we are not that reliant on them. How many things of your class, how many things of your spec that you enjoy, that you feel are making your spec smoother, are coming from borrowed powers? Because conduits are very poor in terms of strength. Conduits are not that powerful, and they also don't really change the way you play a lot, at least for most of the specs. You have your legendary, which is your only, major borrowed power, and then the rest is basically Covenant ability. Yes, of course, you have the outliers like Shifting Power, like Wild Spirits, like Convoke the Spirits, but there is a good amount of Covenant abilities that are just a decent addition to your rotation and to your toolkit without really feeling like you are using them as a crutch, like you're only viable because you have that Covenant ability, or your spec becomes one of the meta flavor of the month specs because of that Covenant ability. So I don't think we are really too over-reliant on borrowed powers so far in Shadowlands. I don't want to jinx it, since we are just on the first tier. Maybe by the end of Shadowlands is going to be an abomination, like the end of BFA with corruptions. Ion also claims some success in being able to slightly, just slightly, shrink the rate of inflation at which we have jumped, leapfrogged, tier from tier, item level from item level, because it has effectively shrunk. Before, we were jumping 15 item levels between tiers. This expansion, we have actually been jumping 13 item levels between tiers. And also, we have gotten some of those 6 item level increases for the harder bosses type of addition, which can help bridge the gap from, for example, heroic raiders getting last 2 bosses at higher item level, which is obviously going to happen more often than the last 2 bosses in Mythic. There are going to be way more kills of Stone Legion and Denatrius in heroic than there are in Mythic, so it's easier for people below Mythic level to get a little bit more item level. I do think something else could be done. Of course, I'm one of those people who just doesn't want LFR and normal mode for raids in the game. That would make it much more easy to shrink the item levels between tiers and between difficulties. I don't think they're gonna go back to that. Then we go into the balance discussion. The lead designer of WoW is talking some balance, and we have some ominous comments regarding Discipline Priest, regarding Holy Paladin, even Unholy Death Knight. So what's he talking about? One of the questions was about the Healer DPS inequality. So not as much the healing done, not as much the throughput or the predominance of damage reduction abilities to rule the raid healer spots, which is a question I was expecting, but it wasn't there. What was there is, hey, what about Holy Paladin and Disc Priest damage in raids? The issue, of course, is free healer DPS. When your regular HPS rotation gives you free damage, and for Holy Paladin it's even worse because it's just their default playstyle. And also Eon specifically singles out Ashen Hallow as an entire problem on its own, like a whole category of a problem just for Ashen Hallow, which is interesting because we have now gone through 2 different rounds of balance tuning in the PTR so far, and Ashen Hallow has not been touched. Maybe they're still thinking about what to do with Ashen Hallow because it is clearly too strong right now when it comes to damage. Another one of the questions was about the raid utility and raid cooldowns. Here as well, we do single out a specific ability like Anti-Magic Zone from Death Knights. Anti-Magic Zone is just too strong, it is too powerful, maybe not because of the ability itself, but because it's an ability that can be used by an entire class, that can be played as a tank or as a DPS. And it is very rare to be able to have a DPS with a pretty powerful raid external that you can use for your defensiveness. So yes, it is going to go up on the nerfing block eventually for 9.1. One of the things Ian mentioned was thinking about going back to what AMZ used to have, which was a total absorption cap. So rather than giving you flat damage reduction, which is very powerful, it just gives you a total absorb, which is much weaker. Another thing he points out is that rogues are basically the last spec remaining that doesn't have any utility anymore in raids. Even specs like Paladins, even if you play Retribution, you have the default Devotion Aura. Yeah, sure, you're gonna have a Holy Paladin in the raid anyways, so it's not that bringing much of anything. But even then, you still have Blessing of Protection, you still have Blessing of Sacrifice even being given to you, whereas rogues are still left with nothing. He does mention they want to emphasize the class utility and not the spec utility, so we can assume if any of the specs are about to get something cool, usable by the whole party or the whole raid, is probably going to be class-wide instead of spec-specific. Another interesting part when it comes to this type of balancing questions is the fact that they are aiming at raising up the total spots for melee DPS in raids up to 7 or 8 melee DPS. And they are working on the encounters with the encounter team to make it so. Right now, ideally, the number of melee is like just how many raid buffs and debuffs do you need. That's about it. If you have a Vengeance tank and if you have a Brewmaster tank, you're gonna want 1 warrior for your shouts and your rallying cry. And technically that's it. Everything else is just gravy. And everything else in this situation is Anti-Magic Zone from Unholy Death Knights. Ideally, you want 4 melee DPS, 1 warrior for your shout and triple DK because of triple AMZ. That's your ideal melee composition in a raid. Instead, he mentions they want to go up to 7 or 8. I think it's very hard to go up to 7 or 8. Again, if you start from the idea of having a Brewmaster tank and a Vengeance tank and 1 warrior, you need 7 more melee. There is no other melee DPS that is going to bring any type of buffs that you need because you have them all covered. Sure, as I mentioned, 2 or 3 unholy DKs because of the AMZ, maybe even Frost DKs, whoever gets balanced to be strong in 9.1, but then you still have 3 to 4 slots left. A Red Paladin right now there's nothing, Rogues right now have nothing, Havoc and Windwalker already have their utility taken by Brewmaster and Vengeance. You have Feral, which is bringing you nothing. You have Enhancement that has 1 Wind Fury, which isn't strong enough to be considered a mandatory pick. So basically the only reason you would want to bring them is if they do a lot of damage, comparable damage to a ranged DPS, possibly even more. So that's going to be interesting. How exactly are they planning to make this work? Then we finish with a very important question, which is about the AOE cap. Now, Ion, as usual, gives the stock standard elusive answer. Yeah, there is definitely more room for evolution. We are working on it. We are keeping a close eye to the situation. We are looking at how it is evolving and we are processing the information and we are very keen on any changes, etc, etc. Now, for the actual answer, after all of this plethora of cliches, he said they are still looking at niches, the 2-target cleave and the 4-target cleave. There are quite a few abilities that cleave on 2 close targets or 4 extra targets. So 3 to 5 enemies total, a lot of them actually. His answer though is pretty confusing because he closes the whole point with a world where uncapped AoE is king, but only a handful of people get it is not where we want to end up. That is what has been happening in Shadowlands though. He says that the current feedback loop in Mythic Plus, which is also because of kiting, is because uncapped AoE is so strong that it allows you to do giant pulls. But because you're doing giant pulls, you can't tank them, therefore you have to kite the entire time. So he even mentions that not only uncapped AoE is OP because it makes the specs that can do uncapped AoE the strongest, it also makes specs that can kite the best, the strongest, because of course if you want to pull 30 mobs, you can tank them all, except the first few 5 or 10 seconds when you have your cooldowns up, and of course Vengeance Demon Hunter is the best at this. It was an interesting question because he didn't actually give any answers on the problem. He didn't actually hint at any solutions. He just pointed out, yeah, a world where uncapped AoE is king is not where we want to be, except we are. And in the PTR so far, there have been no changes to these several uncapped AoE abilities. So not really sure exactly what they're planning to do with this revelation they have given us. All in all, it was a pretty good Q&A. Generally speaking, Preach has good interviews with Ion. He is one of the non-shills that get to have interviews with Ion. So that was pretty good. I am still a little bit disappointed that we are going to go back to Torghast every week. But again, I am not as disappointed as I would have been in BFA if I knew that I would have had to go back to island expeditions every week. I think Torghast is much more enjoyable and manageable to do than island expeditions or even warfronts, God forbid, warfronts. So yeah, okay, it's a little bit annoying, but the time sink of a couple of wings of Torghast every week is manageable. It's not going to sour my experience in the game, so whatever. Okay, it's not that big of a deal. So we can stop here with the interview tomorrow. I think tomorrow we're going to go over the Torghast changes and how Torghast is looking right now. Thank you for watching the video, and you should definitely subscribe to this channel if you have nothing else to do today. I think it's a sound plan. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, just target cap everything or nothing. No in between. Yes, even Earthquake. I'm gonna hurt myself.